Good afternoon. My name is Heather Menzies Munthe-Kaas, and today I will be discussing how to involve end users in the planning of new research in a more systematic and transparent way. So just some information about my work. I have been working on commissioned systematic reviews of effectiveness and qualitative research for more than 10 years. I work with topics related to public health and social welfare. I'm a co-founder of the GRADE-CERQual approach, and together with two colleagues here in Norway, I lead the GRADE-CERQual working group. I also developed the transfer approach, which I will discuss later in this presentation. I will begin by declaring my interests. I have experience working with end users in secondary research, and I have authored papers about involving end users in research. However, I have no commercial or financial interest that would influence this work. So today I'll begin by discussing end user involvement in research generally, and then go on to discuss a couple of the specific challenges related to end user involvement, conflicts of interest, and clarifying roles and expectations. I'll then discuss one potential method for involving end users in the planning of systematic reviews called the transfer approach, and finish by summarizing what we've discussed. Let's get started on discussing end user involvement in research. So what is end user involvement in research? It is an activity that is done with or by patients or members of the public rather than to, about, or for them. It can also be called patient engagement or patient and public involvement, co-production, or citizen science. There's also a variety of terms and massive literature on terminology related to patient, consumer, service user, or stakeholder. I will not engage in that debate today. For the purpose of this presentation, I will use the term end user. So who is an end user, or rather, who is not an end user? An end user could be you or I, a family member, or a colleague. An end user could be a researcher with an illness, for example. It's important not to otherize and think of end users as they and researchers as we, but rather to see an end user as a person. End users can be involved in any and all stages of research, including deciding which research questions should be addressed, what outcomes are important for end users or patients, undertaking the research as an interviewer, or writing up research findings. They can also be included in the broader processes and structures of research, such as identifying and setting research agendas, funding research, or peer reviewing or being members of editorial boards for journals or other publications. In this presentation, we'll focus on end user involvement in the planning of research, that is, identifying and prioritizing research questions, commissioning research, or designing and managing the research study. In this presentation, I will focus on end user involvement in systematic reviews specifically. In a systematic review, the planning stage of the review includes formulating the problem or the review question, usually using a PICO format or SPICE if you're doing qualitative synthesis, and developing and validating a review protocol. This includes developing the search strategy, defining inclusion and exclusion criteria, and identifying any potential subgroup analyses that will be done. So what are the benefits of end user involvement in research? First off, we can improve how power is distributed between researchers and research participants or end users. We can have greater societal expectation of research by developing public understanding of science. Finally, better research studies. This is by increasing relevance and credibility as the research is better informed by the concerns and the needs of the public and end users. This could lead to methods that are more sensitive and better able to effectively engage research participants. This could in turn lead to fuller and more open responses from participants because people with similar experiences have been involved in formulating questions, and this could improve the rates of enrollment in primary research. However, end user involvement in research is not without challenges. Specifically, there are challenges related to costs, time, and money. Researchers may lack the skills to appropriately involve end users. Researchers may have an attitude that science is for scientists, which could prevent them from properly engaging with end users. Patients may lack the skills to carry out research. There could be conflicts of interest of involving end users in research, and there may be unclear roles and expectations of end users in research. For this presentation, I will focus on the last two challenges related to conflicts of interest and roles and expectations. Let's discuss conflicts of interest. First, what is a conflict of interest? A conflict of interest is when there is a substantial risk that secondary interests of one or more stakeholders in research unduly influence their judgment and thereby compromise or undermine the primary interest of the research or the research goal. But what is an interest? An interest is a commitment, a goal, or a value held by an individual or an institution. It can be financial, personal, institutional, or ideological. Although financial interests have traditionally been the focus of conflict of interest policies and discussion, there is increasing attention to non-financial interests. So non-financial interests are the other ones. They're the ones without any direct or any financial element. Political, ideological, individual, intellectual, or religious, for example. End-user interests can influence various stages of the research process. But maybe more interestingly is that the primary and the secondary interests, so the interest we're trying to protect or the research goal, and any other interests can vary throughout the research process. So when you're developing a research question, the primary interest may be to improve the health of a patient group. So for example, what is the effect of exercise on depression? But when conducting the research, the primary interest may shift to focus on obtaining scientifically valid results. For example, ensuring that the research is done using rigorous methods. And then when disseminating the research, the primary interest may be to ensure that the research is understandable and clear for all stakeholders. End-user interests can also influence the broader processes and structures of research, as I mentioned before, related to funding or peer review of a journal. So, is this so dangerous? What can happen if conflicts of interest are ignored? Well, a secondary interest can affect a person's judgment, their reasoning, their motivation, or their behavior. And doing so, this could create a biased judgment or decision. This could lead to biased or inaccurate findings, which could lead to the damaged reputation of either the research or the researchers. This could undermine the potential or perceived value of the research by those who are using it, which in turn could contribute to research waste. Finally, research decisions that are based on research where conflicts of interest are present and not addressed may then not be informed by reliable evidence. This could result in implementing interventions that have no effect or could lead to harm. This also could waste resources. So remembering that end users could be you or I and are just people, end users could have a variety of interests that may unduly influence research. It could be related to their own health or well-being. It could be financial incentives for participating in research. There could be cultural beliefs or values that influence, or social or professional interests. For example, a study by Ashcroft 2016, studies by Cottrell 2011, and Barnes 2012 show that patients are motivated to be involved in research for a variety of reasons. For example, improving skills or gaining work experience, to meet other people, to feel useful, to put their knowledge and experience of being ill or caring to good use, because of religious commitments, to gain a better understanding of certain health problems, to gain financial income, to challenge the assumption that research is academically or clinically led, to make a difference to diagnosis, treatment, and service delivery, or to have a voice. Some of these can be viewed as secondary interests that could conflict with the primary interest, and some of them are unlikely to be viewed as a conflict of interest. Given the variety of motivations for getting involved in research, it's unlikely that end users are without interests. However, this seems to be underemphasized and rarely discussed in the literature. For example, in the document Ethical Considerations for Health Policy and Systems Research, developed by the Alliance for Health Policy and Systems Research at the WHO together with the Global Health Ethics Unit, there is a lot of discussion on conflicts of interest. Namely that researchers, funders, or health institutions must disclose their conflicts of interest. There's also quite a bit on patient involvement, that patients should be engaged from the very beginning of research. However, there is no mention of patients disclosing conflicts of interest. There appears to be an assumption that patients and patient groups have no secondary interests that could influence their research. So end users involved in research may also belong to a patient group. A patient group or a patient advocacy organization is a nonprofit group whose primary mission is to combat a particular disease or disability or to work toward improving health and well-being of a particular population. These groups can be organized or unorganized and can represent minority groups or people with illnesses or disabilities. A patient group could have interests that could unduly influence the research goal, and thereby an end user who belongs to this patient group may also have interests that may influence the research goal. So for example, in a study by McCoy and colleagues in 2017, among 104 of the largest US-based patient advocacy organizations, at least 83% received financial support from a drug, a device, or a biotechnology company. And at least 39% had a current or a former industry executive on their governing board. So these kind of financial relationships between patient organizations and drug, device, or biotechnology companies could lead to biases that affect research. For example, if an end user who belongs to a patient advocacy organization that has such relationships is involved in funding or prioritizing research topics, this could lead to a biased research agenda, the consequences of which could be an overemphasis on treatments for large or well-organized patient groups. So in many areas of research, it is accepted that there is no such thing as a neutral view, or as Donna Haraway put it, a view from nowhere. Everyone, including end users, bring their own perspectives and interests to a research project. Thus, we have a view from somewhere, and we're trying to understand where that somewhere is and how that may affect the research. So we need strategies to balance the benefits of including end users' views against the inevitable secondary interests they bring with them to research. There are three main categories of strategies to manage conflicts of interest. There's regulation of the individual, design and regulation of the research process, or critical assessment of the research product. We will often find a combination of strategies to address conflicts of interest. In this presentation, we're going to focus on strategies that regulate the individual and regulate the research process. In the category regulation of the individual, there are two main strategies. The first is public disclosure of interests by all researchers and end users involved in research. This involves declaring any actual, perceived, or potential conflicts of interest. The second strategy is abstention or prohibition from research activities. This involves ensuring that researchers or end users refrain from participating in all or specific stages of research where their interests may unduly influence the research goal. Let's discuss public disclosure in a little bit more detail. It is a simple strategy, and it should be a minimum requirement. Yet disclosure does have its limits. It's not very useful for preventing or helping to identify or avoid the appearance of bias, and it's not very helpful for finding out whether conflicts of interest are present. Furthermore, while disclosure could be expected to increase trust, evidence actually suggests that doctors and research participants both have less confidence in the quality of a trial design when the trial is industry funded, despite this being reported in a conflict of interest statement. The next category of strategies relates to the design and regulation of the research process. These strategies include conflict of interest policies, education of researchers and end users on conflicts of interest, informed and non-conflicted reviews of research proposals, rigorous overview by research supervisors, public registration of trials, and incorporating qualitative methods. So let's discuss in more detail how we can incorporate qualitative methods in order to address conflicts of interest. Specifically, we can borrow methods from the qualitative tradition in order to diminish some of the effects of secondary interests and biases. Specifically, we can borrow the following strategies to address rigor, representation, and reflexivity. So rigor. How do we know that the interpretation of end users' perspectives has been done well and is applicable to other end users? When end user involvement strategies include a broad range of end user perspectives, the research team, including end user researchers, may use unsystematic methods to incorporate these perspectives. Alternatively, when one or two end user researchers' views are included in a research team, the research team may not necessarily check that these end user views are representative of other end users. These issues can be addressed through member checking, where the research team takes end user input back to other end users to ensure that perspectives are relatively representative. We could also address these concerns via dense description, whereby researchers provide detailed descriptions of end users, how they were involved in the research, and how their involvement influenced the design or the conduct of the study. Or the research team could use constant comparative analysis, whereby there is an ongoing check with end users or groups to ensure that any secondary interests are not unduly influencing the primary goal of the research. We can also consider representation. Are multiple and diverse end user perspectives being sought? So one reason for end user input is to have their lived experience of healthcare or a social welfare intervention or a health condition contribute to the optimization of a research study design. So in general, we can think that one perspective is better than none, but more is better than one. However, this can be time consuming or cost a lot of money to involve end users. So we need to consider how engagement can be made accessible to end users from diverse backgrounds and which involvement strategies are most appropriate for which groups of end users. The third strategy is related to reflexivity. The question is, have all researchers taken a reflexive stance? And by this we mean, have we considered the relationship between the researchers and the participants and between the researchers and the research topic? And here we need to think of the end users as the same as the researchers, where they also analyze and consider their relationship to the participants and the research topic. Glenton and colleagues have an article in press right now and recommend that we use a reflexive discussion in the methods section of the protocol for a systematic review, where we consider our prior positions, how those positions influence the decisions you make at various points of the research study, and whether the researchers used any strategies to address these issues. Also, the research team should include a reflexive discussion in the results section, where they consider their positions and how that could have influenced the research study, and how their positions changed during the research study. An example of what a reflexivity discussion could look like comes from a systematic review of qualitative research on healthcare workers' perceptions and experiences of communicating with people over 50 about vaccination. So this is just an excerpt. The review authors say they considered how their individual and collective views, beliefs, and experiences could have influenced the choices they made. 4 of the 6 review authors are over 50 years of age. None of the review authors provide patient care. All of the review authors believe it is important for people to have easy access to evidence-based information about vaccination. So let's consider another example and how qualitative methods could address a potential conflict of interest. So if a research goal is to explore what factors women and their partners consider when making family planning decisions, an end user involved in this research may state that according to their religious beliefs, abortion is wrong. There may be a possible conflict between the end user's interests and the research goal or the primary interest. For example, we may then exclude questions related to abortion or other family planning options. In order to manage this potential conflict of interest, we could use a reflexivity exercise for researchers and the end users involved in research, where everybody involved in the research study considers their prior positions, how this could influence decisions during the research study, and develop strategies to address any of these issues. Let's move on now to consider another challenge of end user involvement in research, which is clarifying roles and expectations of end users. As I mentioned in the beginning, we are going to be focusing in this presentation on how to involve end users in the planning of research in a more systematic and transparent way. With respect to systematic reviews, this applies then to the stages where we formulate the problem or review question and develop and validate the review protocol. So another challenge of involving end users in research is unclear roles and expectations of their contributions. In most cases, end users may not have training in academic methods, and they may be unfamiliar with research jargon. In some cases, end users may even feel intimidated when working with researchers and wonder what or how they could contribute. By clearly stating the goal of involving end users, we can help ensure that both researchers and end users are satisfied with the collaboration. And one method for doing this is clearly defining the role of the end user, where they should be expected to participate in a research study, and the expectations about their contribution. In most cases, end users sit with information that researchers don't have. It's important to consider that everyone involved in research is an expert on something and therefore has valuable input. On that note, let's look at an example of using end users in research, the transfer approach. So the transfer approach is a method to support systematic and transparent collaboration between researchers and stakeholders in order to consider contextual factors when undertaking evidence synthesis for decision-making. The goal of user involvement in transfer is to ensure relevant, useful, and usable systematic review findings. Specifically, users are involved in creating clear and relevant review questions and considering context or the factors that may influence the transferability of review findings to a specific decision-making context. Although many review teams consult with commissioners, stakeholders, or end users to develop and refine review questions, not all do so in a systematic and transparent manner. Furthermore, in a traditional systematic review, we may not consider how specific contextual factors may or may not influence the transferability of review findings until the end of the review, when we apply grade and consider the indirectness domain. With the transfer approach, we begin collaborating with end users at the planning stage of the review, where the end users are involved in a structured, systematic, and transparent process to define the review question and consider contextual factors that may influence the transferability of the review finding to the review context. In this way, the role and expectation of the end user is clearly defined and limited. The end users bring with them their knowledge and experience with the specific intervention or decision-making context being examined in the review. The review team then conducts the systematic review and, using the information provided by the end users, are able to come up with relevant, useful, and usable review findings that are applicable to the review context or a local decision-making context. So transfer was not developed as an intellectual or theoretical exercise, but rather as an answer to an expressed need from decision makers. So let's look at transfer in practice. A systematic review examining experiences with housing programs is commissioned and one of the findings is that homeless people prefer housing programs that allow them to choose their own housing. At the end of the review process, decision makers are left wondering, does this finding apply to our setting? If the decision makers could take a time machine back to the beginning of the review process, they could say, we are wondering about housing programs for homeless people in Norway, and the review team would be able to help. Together, end users and review authors can meet for a couple of hours to define the review question and discuss contextual or transferability factors. Firstly, the end users and review team work together to define the review question using a template. Using a template ensures a few things. First, there's a structured discussion of the review question and inclusion criteria, whereby the end users and review team go through each issue in a systematic way. Secondly, there's a transparent record of the discussion for posterity. For example, if questions arise as to whether a review includes children 6 to 18 years old and not 4 to 21 years old. Finally, the template can help to ensure that regardless of who is in the review team or who the end users are, the formulation and definition of the review question is done in the same manner. This could be an example of defining the review question where the review team has some ideas for inclusion criteria, has some questions for the decision makers or end users, and together they arrive at the final inclusion criteria. Next, the end users and review team consider contextual factors that may influence the transferability of the review findings to the review context or a predefined local context. This is based on a structured conversation guide that acts as a list of prompts for discussion. The end users are asked to consider if they would, for example, be concerned if data comes from contexts where the data was collected at a different point in time, or the geographical, political, or economic context is different. At the end of this meeting, the review team is left with 3 to 5 hypothesized transferability factors that can be then used to conduct subgroup analyses in reviews of effectiveness, or to explore when discussing review findings from qualitative evidence syntheses. It's important to note here that since these are hypotheses, some of the identified contextual factors may not influence transferability, thereby potentially dispelling any commonly held myths from end users or researchers on the transferability of review findings to specific contexts. So, for example, decision makers making decisions related to employment in a European country may be resistant to implementing an intervention where most of the studies in a systematic review come from America, because the hiring and the firing practices are very different. However, by moving away from this idea of Europe versus America and identifying specific contextual factors and then conducting a subgroup analysis based on these, the end users and the researchers may find that these specific the review findings are actually transferable despite these different hiring and firing practices. So, for example, in this review on homelessness, the end users and review authors think, what factors could influence the transferability of the review findings to the Norwegian context? And maybe they come up with climate is an important factor. So after the meeting with the end users, the review team then goes to conduct the systematic review. And as part of this process, extracts data related to the contextual factor they identified, in this case, climate. They can then use this to do a subgroup analysis, if allowed, at the end. And this could tell them about the applicability to the local context. So an assessment of this, for example, could be the review finding is housing programs lead to more days in stable housing compared to usual services. When we look at the climate factor, there may be no concerns because all of the studies included in the review were conducted only in settings with cold climates, which is similar to Norway. And then the review team could say there was 10 studies supporting this and make an overall assessment of minor concerns. That there may be minor differences between the included studies and the review context with respect to other contextual factors such as length of homelessness and quality of usual services, but there are no substantial differences between the included studies and the review context regarding climate. The assessment of transferability can then be used to support the assessment of the grade and directness domain or the GRADE-CERQual component relevance, similar to how the risk of bias tool feeds into the risk of bias domain in GRADE. The review team then can present the review findings and state that they have no concerns about the transferability of the finding to the Norwegian context because the data comes from studies that were done in cold countries. It's advantageous to combine transfer then with a discussion of reflexivity throughout the review process, as we discussed earlier, and a pre-trial or pre-review disclosure of interests. So in summary, end user involvement in research is not without challenges. In particular, end users have interests, and we need to balance the benefits of including end users' views with managing the inevitable secondary interests they bring with them. There are strategies available for managing such conflicts of interest, but we also need to consider clearly defining the roles and expectations of user involvement. Transfer approach for systematic and transparent collaboration to consider context is one such method. Thank you very much for your time. Please feel free to contact me via email if you have any questions, and a list of references is available upon request.